all of that in the US is not legal. And that is a bigger illegal sales market than there ever was during the Prohibition. An old pro, that was probably $15 or less back in the day. Now it is hard to find those bottles for less than $500. You can collect sports cards, you can collect watches, you can collect clothing items, shoes. But the thing you're not really doing with that is sharing them.
This is the Future of the Future show. I am your host, Mateo Berbejicio. What happens when you take a centuries-old industry like fine wine and spirits and rebuild it for the digital age? In this episode, we sit down with Scott Manning to unpack the story behind BAXUS, a platform reimagining how people buy, own, and trade collectible bottles. We'll dive into the origin story, the mechanics of how it all works, the challenges of bridging physical and digital worlds, and why spirits might be one of the most interesting emerging asset classes today. And yes, we will also find out what's in Scott's personal collection. Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
For listeners new to it, what exactly is BAXUS and how will you explain it simply?
All right. BAXUS, in the most simplest terms, is a marketplace where people, collectors from all over the world can send in their bottles, trade them online, and have them purchased by people without that bottle ever having to move. There is other facets of the business. We work with distilleries, and we have a tool that allows distilleries and warehouses to track their barrels wherever they're at, to estimate the value of the contents within those barrels. We also have an app called Booze App that allows people to contribute pricing so that we can all collectively understand what the market value of any bottle in existence is. And the power of all three of these tools allows us to have a pretty good idea of what every bottle is worth and the ways for people to sell those bottles, collect those bottles, and otherwise use those bottles as a different asset class for where they want to spend and save and earn money.
What's the origin story? Why you and the team decided to build a booze marketplace in the first place?
I'll try to keep this short. So I actually joined the team in 2023. Me and my partner, Rich, we built an app called Booze App back in 2020 when we'll get into this later, but there was a massive uptick in people that were being introduced to bourbon and whiskey and otherwise spirits during the COVID time. At the same time, the business that we are now was getting started and building a marketplace. The impetus for getting that going was Svi, our CEO, who was a whiskey broker for quite a bit of time. He personally was having to manage the transportation of these bottles that were being bought and sold all across the world. And that got really tricky. It got, to the point where some of these bottles are 100, 200 years old. And when you're trying to transport that, that's not very easy. And when a lot of people are purchasing these bottles, especially of that class, their point is not always to open and drink that bottle and have that there. They are using this as a way, in the same way that people will buy, sell, and trade art, just as a way to kind of, increase the kind of asset portfolio that they have in a different category. That also was very inaccessible to most people. And so when it came to how people wanted to buy, sell, and trade, we realized that the majority of the bottle owners are people that don't understand they have the capacity to sell these bottles or continue, collecting in other ways. They don't understand the value of their collections and how much their collections are actually worth. And giving them that visibility, and then giving them the ability to place those bottles in a marketplace, sell those bottles at the price they want, sell the way they want it, without having to handle any of the logistics, that became the main idea. So when Booze App, which was more of this kind of pricing tool, merged with BAXUS, which was this marketplace that was built on blockchain, we now became this place where we could collectively with all the information that's coming in from users, tell you what the price of every single bottle is or should be, tell you what it was and likely what it could be, and then give you the place where you can buy, sell, and trade with those other collectors.
What core problem in the spirits market are you solving that other traditional auctions or retailers had not fixed before?
It's a great question. Um, as I mentioned, back when SFI was doing the kind of one by one whiskey trading, the problems there were, again, that the transportation of bottles, especially these rarer bottles, was incredibly difficult. People weren't actually wanting to open these bottles all the time, or if they did, it was for special occasions. So they wanted it to otherwise be kept in a very secure, safe place. The other end of it was the lack of transparency on pricing. We're a part of several groups of hundreds of thousands of people that their entire point of this group is to collectively talk about prices and share bottles that they have and they don't know what the value of is. And so to this day, one of the biggest things that we've accomplished as the course of this is when we started, we were revealing prices that, to be honest, a lot of people in the industry didn't want revealed. There's a lot of players in the game. There's a lot of hands, as there is a imposed three-tier system, at least in the US. A lot of other countries kind of have echoed that. And what that means is the distillery, for the most part, cannot sell directly to the consumer. They can advertise, they can talk to the retailers, but ultimately they can't even sell to the retailers. They can't sell to the consumers. They have to sell to a secondary party. That secondary party then sells to all of the, third tier, all the retailers and whatnot, and then the retailers sell to the consumers. There is no solution for consumers to sell to consumers, at least from a legal standpoint. And there's not much in the way of retailers being able to have transparency to understand what pricing should I put to this bottle? What are people going to actually pay for this? They know what they paid for it, but in terms of how to mark that up and what's going to be, the what's hot in the market, what's going to be the right price for that, that's a blank space for them. So over the course of 2020 to 2023, one of the things that we were able to do with the app and with the pricing stuff we were doing was sort of, I won't toot our horn too much, but when we started, no distilleries were really publishing prices. They were essentially letting the bottles go. They didn't have control over the prices. They only sold to the party that sells to the party that sells to the party.
Right.
When we hit about 2022, we started seeing prices put on all of the press releases for all these bottles. We started seeing more understanding and more kind of requirement of these distilleries to come up with an MSRP. And we have been told by several people that they saw that as a bit of a revolution in when we started identifying and showing that you can put a price to something, then the consumer side starts to require that. Right. And now there's a lot more transparency. We saw that as well in the auto market. Things like Auto Trader and Cars.com got kicked off in very early .com era, but their whole impetus was, let's try and figure out how to make pricing more transparent. And from what I understand, this is before I was going to car lots trying to buy cars, but from what I understand, you would go to a car lot and there wasn't a price tag. There wasn't a real understanding of what you could drive away with that car costing. And now you can't go to a car lot and see anything, or you can't see any car for the most part without a big sticker on there saying, this is what it costs. This is, our MSRP for that. And it's the crowdsourced power. It's the power of the consumers and enabling them to provide data to share with others that allows the market to shift in a positive and transparent way.
You might not be able to answer this one, but who are the biggest players that are suffering the most because of how you are making the market more transparent? A few names come to mind, but is there anyone that you can name, or you rather not name them?
Can name? Yes. I will hold off because honestly, what I feel is that a transparent market solves problems for everybody. There are certainly players that prefer things to be obscure. I'll take, for example, the what's called the secondary market. So one of my favorite stats to share is that right now the secondary market of spirits, like essentially whiskey, but a lot of other spirits as well, is about $8 to $9 billion. That's consumer to consumer, secondary sales, post retail. All of that in the US is not legal. And that is a bigger illegal sales market than there ever was during the Prohibition. And so for that 10-year period, we're actually outpacing them in terms of the volume of bottles that are being illegally traded. But in the same way of like music, and you had the advent of Napster and things like that, that definitely weren't the, let's call it the most legal approach. But that became the reason that Apple created iTunes. That became the reason that some of these other music publishers started allowing for digital trade, digital transfer, and selling songs. And what we saw was people did that. iTunes very quickly took over all of the downloading crowd, even though they were charging money, because it became a more reasonable means for getting what you wanted. People don't want to necessarily do things below the board.
Yeah.
And so if you give them a way to do that easily and give them more access, then that becomes the solution that they accept. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Fair enough. Can you walk us through how BAXUS actually works, from owning a bottle to trading it on the platform?
Yeah, sure. Let me start here. Do you have any preferences of spirits? What's your spirit of choice?
Elijah Gregg.
Okay. Elijah Craig, good one. So you find a bottle of Elijah Craig. You were gifted it, or you bought it on a shelf. Let's say it's an 18-year. One of the first things we see is if you start to get into whiskey spirits, you're of course like drinking it, you're enjoying it, you're probably being shared some with friends.
Yep.
And doing some sharing yourself once you start your collection. You get to a point where you are curious, well, I want this bottle. This costs, this much, or I think it costs this much, or I looked it up and this is what it is. That's more than I have. What can I do? When you don't have a way to see your collection as a sellable resource in order to improve it and work, have the bottles that you actually want to have, that becomes a bit of a sinkhole, and it gets you actually out of that collectible space a little bit faster. And so when you start to see these bottles as collectibles, you are driven toward finding a solution that allows you to continue collecting. And what we would do essentially is you would say, all right, I've got this Elijah Craig 18-year. I don't necessarily want this bottle. I want this other bottle over here. Right. And you might see that on our website. You might see that elsewhere. It's going to have a price tag of some sort. So you sending your Elijah Craig 18-year to us allows you then to sell that. And once you sell that, you have capital. You can go and use that and spend that on the site buying someone else's bottle. You can use that to make offers on other bottles. And when you're able to procure the bottle that you want, you can ship that bottle back to yourself. Or if you're like, you know what, I think I can hold on to this, trade this longer. You see the statistics of, here's what the price was 2 years ago. Here's what the price is now. And we don't do this immediately right now. We're going to work on this, but to make some predictions as far as where it could go, that is something that we try to give you enough tools to make that, answer that yourself. And whether you want to keep that bottle in our vault and sell it onward or ship it back home, you can do either of those options. So that's primarily how the marketplace works, how you send in the bottles. When it comes to the other parts of it, so one of the things that really kicked us off was we started out just as a pricing tool, just as an index of like, here's, look up the bottle, scan the barcode of it, whatever. Here's the price. Here's what other people are paying. Here's what we think is the right price. We then added a feature that allowed you to track your own collection, just kept it really simple. I have this bottle. Great. Save that. But what that did is we kept an index of like, what's your collection worth? And open bottles, of course, not worth this, it's worth sharing. We'll call it that. But in terms of like selling it onward, people aren't necessarily trying to sell open bottles. A lot of complications with that. But when you have a closed bottle, we will tell you the value of your entire collection. We'll tell you what you paid. A lot of times the value of your collection is more than what you paid. And then now with the marketplace, we give you that ability to make good on that. Like if we're saying your collection's worth $2,000, how do you turn those bottles into $2,000? Well, you can sell them on this marketplace. And, by and large, you can keep that money, or again, you can use that to increase your collection, trade upwards, whatever you want to do with that.
I love it. Question: do bottles typically increase in price as time goes by? Does it depend on the bottle, on the spirit, on the wine? How does that typically work?
There is there's a lot of distilleries, a lot of players in the game in terms of, who's making bottles, who's been making bottles. One of the wonderful things about spirits and especially whiskey is these brands tend to have some longevity to them. A lot of new brands, even, they get their start by buying barrels from these more historical
Hmm.
distilleries. Sometimes they can share that information. Sometimes it's a bit of a closed door deal, but the people who are pretty keen on how something should taste, you can generally pick up tastes from certain distilleries and know, like, if you're familiar with their mash bill, you're familiar with their flavor, and you can kind of say, oh, well, this bottle's that. So what we're seeing is you have a lot of historical distilleries that have a lot of provenance with just their name. You have a lot of older bottles that maybe back in the 70s or 80s when they were released, they were just kind of bottom shelf, not really a popular item. And now the fact that there are so few of them, they have become more and more rare. And we've discovered that, oh wow, Old Crow from 1974 is actually incredible. And when you crack that open today, it's like one of the best experiences that you can have. Like, they call that old dusties. So there's a lot of things that go into the value of a bottle. There's certainly like the provenance of the bottle itself, of the brand, of the distillery, and a lot of what gets traded comes down to that hype. And one of the things that we are trying to do better is understanding like what drives that hype and at least like mapping it out. Like, we can't necessarily predict what bottle is going to explode next, but we do know when there is something that hits the market in a certain way and we start to see it in these pockets that we're paying attention to, we know it's going to go like this. And when we see that, we try to get ahead of it. We try to make sure we find collectors who have that, and we encourage them to send their bottles in, because we know that that's going to be something that people are going on the site, trying to look up, trying to trade. And that value, depending on the source of that value, again, if it's hype, we'll say, then just like many collectibles that get typed up, there is a bit of a bell curve where it goes up, it's reached its peak, it kind of sometimes stays, but its staying power at that point is determined by the people that do crack it open and drink it and decide, wow, that is an incredible,
Right.
bottle. And then that can kind of keep going on from there. Or people, do open it and they kind of, come off of the buzz of that. Or there's other products that are maybe even a very similar batch, where they're like, actually, we do this all the time where we say, oh, this is the poor man's Weller, this is the poor man's Van Winkle, meaning these bottles that become by and large inaccessible. There's always a little brother that you could enjoy the contents of it at a significant fraction of the price. But then by doing so, that makes that brand even more inaccessible and difficult. So
Right.
we see that all the time. Van Winkle and Weller being a really good example in that they, uh, you have a lot of producers, a lot of distilleries that will produce a bottle pretty, high quality and high visibility and low quantity. And then they see the success of that and they're like, well, we can't produce more of that. That would actually kind of make the price of that and the value of that go lower. So they'll produce another thing that is almost the same mash bill, almost the same quality, if not exactly the same. And they'll sell it as a different product because they have, more of that. They just don't want to, ruin the reputation of this
Right.
product, but give, more people access. But people do catch on. And it is really fascinating to see how that interplays. We've even seen over the course of the past, 7 years that I've been monitoring this personally. We see bottles that went from a $25 bottle sitting somewhere near the bottom of the shelf to an over $300 bottle that
Ooh.
you can barely get today. And that's the bottom tier of that. You're seeing a bottle again, that example I showed of an Old Crow that was probably $15 or less back in the day. Now it is hard to find those bottles for less than $500 and more around like the $1,000 and $1,500 range, depending on the year.
If you are listening, time to go check your bottles and see, and go into BAXUS and see what they are really priced right now. Um, Scott, what were some of the biggest hurdles you faced building BAXUS, especially combining physical assets, blockchain, and everything in the digital space?
Yeah. So I got to shortcut that. So again, we were working, my partner and myself, Rich, we were working on this side, the pricing side.
Right.
And I'm going to give 100% of the credit to Svi and Carrie, the co-founders of
Right.
BAXUS, because they saw that problem that Svi was outlining, and at the same time, that was when NFTs were starting to kick off. NFT were, if you're inside the crypto industry, NFTs were very exciting. It was a new way to buy, sell, and trade, a new kind of commodity. Um, but what we really saw was a lot of people who understood the technology behind NFTs, understood, a lot of the purposes. There's several purposes for it, but one of the main purposes was to bring the value of blockchain into the physical world by essentially having a certificate of ownership and authenticity digitally represented, corroborated by thousands of other nodes, and essentially proving the provenance of whatever resource it is. Doing so with digital assets was fleeting because you would see, a picture of something that was digitally created. Sometimes even everything is art, right? You can call anything art, but let's just say it was a little bit more of the lower, lower skilled art. It wasn't exactly the Mona Lisa. Some of these, digital NFTs. Um, but when it came to the bridge between tying that NFT to a physical item, that's where power really started to show up. They recognized that, honestly, I think before many people did, and that became the goal that they wanted to achieve, and they worked toward that for about 2-3 years. They got through the hardest timeline of NFTs, which was during the FTX collapse and all of that. NFT became such a dirty word
Yeah.
in all the industries. And a lot of that was because of the misunderstanding of how that can be utilized as a technology. So proud that they stayed the course. We, at that time, we were building two separate companies, and we would talk to each other quite often, every couple of months, and just check in, see how everyone's doing. And when it came to a point, they had reached the ability to take a bottle, we have liquor licenses. We have ways that we can acquire those bottles, legally. We have ways that we can sell them, so that if we were to be a completely non-chain operation, it could still, work above board. However, adding in and utilizing blockchain to, again, prove the provenance, to make sure that ownership is completely clear. It's not us in our singular database saying, "Oh, you own this," and then, oops, our database got hacked or wiped or whatever. It's everywhere. The information about you owning that Elijah Craig 18 is everywhere. It's on the internet. It's ledgered everywhere. And that's an important thing to have, because there's a lot of conflict in the trading world of like ownership of a thing. And proving that ownership has by and large been a very difficult process. And again, isolated to a single point of information. What if that single point of information fails? Then what? What happens to this thing that you do not have in your possession physically? And then you have no other way of basically saying, oh, yeah, that thing that is over here, that's mine. So being able to utilize that tech was really solid. And now we're seeing, in the same way that I feel like Booze App changed MSRPs for the spirits industry, I am seeing BAXUS change the crypto world, because now there are many companies coming up and saying, hey, we can do this with watches, we can do this with cars, we can do this with art, we can do this with oil. And so there is
Yeah.
lots of tools out there now that will use NFT technology, blockchain, to associate a physical item with something digitally and be able to trade that as a currency. And the currency is based on the physical item it represents, not on some currency that can ebb and flow with hype and collapsing marketplaces.
Yeah, yeah, and in a world where AI is everywhere and the cost of software goes down, or the ability to build software goes down, your connection to the physical world, the connection that you make between the two, is a special thing. It's a differentiator like nothing else. So that is amazing. Looking ahead, what opportunities excite you the most, both for Baxus and for Spirits as a collectionable asset class?
I, going back to sort of the three main things that BAXUS is working on. One of those main things we're calling it Athena, but is essentially a barrel a barrel tracking and barrel commoditizing tool. In that there are I can't remember the exact statistics, somewhere around 4 billion barrels that are in the state in the US at any given moment. And they're not yet bottles. They're not yet turned into a product. They may not even have a specific product that they should be turned into, because essentially it's just what was distilled at this distillery and, has this particular barrel, this particular age. It's in this particular rickhouse. Those elements do give that barrel value. But it's not really clear until it becomes a bottle. It's not really clear what the value is. It's a kind of a potential versus kinetic.
Right.
And what we have is a solution that allows for two things. First, those barrels still are physical items. There are things that happen to rickhouses and warehouses all the time. Over the course of the past 10 years, there's been like 3 or 4 major rickhouse failures, including fires, collapses, mudslides, wind that's blown them over, barrels that have just evaporated because of the wrong air, flow. And all of these things are obviously huge losses to the businesses that operate them. If you have a rickhouse that has what essentially equates to $1 billion of potential value, and you lose that, that's kind of your 10-year plan.
Yeah.
And so in the process of trying to give people more information about their rickhouses, and particularly about the barrels that are inside of them, we now have proprietary technology that allows anyone at any anyone who you want to have access to this, but from anywhere, you can tap into the information of what rickhouse, what location in your rickhouse, and you can see ethanol levels, you can see wind speed, you can see certain other elements, airflow, temperature, weather reports, and you can anticipate things happening. At the same time, we've developed some new technology, and this is coming out very, very soon, that allows you to track every single barrel. And there's been a lot of attempts to solve that problem. These barrels are moving all the time. Sometimes they're rotating them within the rickhouse. Sometimes they're moving them to a completely different location. Sometimes they're being bought, sold, traded, and so that barrel is going places. Trying to keep track of a single barrel is like a needle in a haystack in a lot of ways. We've seen a lot of companies operate on spreadsheets. We've seen a lot of companies operate on a singular piece of paper. And those are obviously systems that they're using because of the lack of other, more accessible ways of tracking that. The tech that we have coming out allows them to treat the barrel as they're treating it now. They don't have to make sure that anything, there's no RFID tags or anything like that can fall off or otherwise be impossible to scan if it's rolled the wrong way. The tech that we're using is allowing these rickhouses to know every single bottle that crosses a threshold, where it is at any given point, and to relay that information to whoever the actual owner of that barrel is. And that's a really cool tech that we haven't seen out there, even in the time that we've been developing this. And that those that we're partnering with during this process are just stoked on it. Not just for the historical data they then start to collect and be able to analyze and understand, why is this barrel in this corner of the rickhouse aging and flavored differently than this one? They're the exact same distillate. They have more information now to be able to understand that over time. And I would even say, probably more importantly, information about where that is, so that they can know where it's going and keep record of that and understand their own potential of their collection. You can kind of equate it to like a singular person who collects bottles. That's sort of like a rickhouse. It's just a bigger, scale. And if you have barrels going in and out, people buying and selling them and trading them, you need some capacity to be able to track all that. And that's what we're building.
Do you see what happens if a big distillery comes your way and say, okay, I want to buy everything you have, will work for me, but I want it just for me, so I want to buy you out?
Well, that's be an interesting conversation to have for sure. And I'll speak more to, what we can kind of do for distilleries. And I will say that we have had some really good talks with some big name distilleries. We're piloting with a few of these. I can't reveal names, but they're incredible opportunities, and they're in it for the long game. They want to have this technology um, for a long period of time, because if you're just seeing it in a moment, you know, that the data you get as far as ethanol levels, weather, whatever, that is good in real time in case you can catch something that is happening categorically. If the right conditions occur and there's a fire potential, then you can kind of shore up against that, or make sure that your sprinkler systems are ready to go if there were to be anything. So that's a value. But a lot of these businesses, they play the long game. It's one of the only industries where you make a product and you can't sell that product for somewhere between 4 and 10 years.
Yeah.
And that's you have to look forward in the market, and that's a really difficult thing to do without much data. And so if we were to have, you know, businesses that come and say, hey, we want this, we're really apt to make this stuff bespoke. Like the platform that we're building is, with the fact that distilleries, especially larger ones, they have their own level of operations. They have their things that they're doing that's unique in the industry, and we want to support that. And so we knew that in advance. We wanted to make sure that the platform and the tools that we built were flexible enough to allow them to feel like this is their own property, this is their own interface, their own tool. You know, essentially enterprise sales at that point, and we're certainly eager to play game at that level with this particular product.
So interesting. Scott, one last question to you on a personal note. I know this one is hard to answer, but do you have a favorite bottle? Which one?
I do, and it's hidden. I'm looking at my shelf right now, and it's I've tucked it away from myself because I don't see them anymore, and I don't want to drink all of it right away. So,
Right.
yeah, my favorite bottle right now is a Michter's 10-year bourbon, and it's incredible. A lot of the selection of Michter's, they do a really, really good job. A couple years ago, our team was able to go to the distillery and take a deeper tour within like the Michter's operation in Louisville, and it's fascinating because they're a really interesting example of a distillery that has an incredible history, a very rich history, but that history isn't with a single owner. It's not even with a single location. And so there's a lot of places where Michter's has been distilled and produced, and where it is now is fairly new. The brand itself got purchased, sold, traded, and they more or less had to start from scratch in a lot of ways. And so when you see these older brands, these historical brands, like going through that, it's a bit of a shaking of your, you know, interest in that brand. Like, what's the new ownership going to do? What are they going to, you know, how are they going to honor the name of this 150-year-old establishment?
Right.
And it's really, really excellent when you see them taking that seriously. And so Michter's, across, you know, all their products, is one of the most solid bourbons out there, and rye and the other things they produce. But that particular bottle, it's so good. It's such a tasty one. I'm going to put two. I'm going to make two on my list. My other favorite, one of the things about me is, before I started Booze App with Rich, I didn't drink at all. I didn't drink beer. I didn't drink wine. I didn't drink whiskey. I grew up as a non-drinker, and I got to a point where I was like, I don't know, I don't really have a need for this resistance against it, so I might as well try it. So Rich and I got together, and he gave me a smattering of all of his favorite bottles and things that he had, and I was like, I'm sure I'm going to taste it and hate it. And I was like, first one I tasted, I was like, this is great. I don't know what I was thinking. And so since then, my first bottle that I ever purchased myself was an Old Granddad. What was it? It's like a very squatty bottle, Old Granddad bottled in bond. Again, I was like, not really sure how I wanted to invest in this, and it was a $30 bottle. I was like, that's doable. I brought it home. I showed it to Rich because we were working remotely, and I was like, look what I got. And he's like, cool, that's gonna, you know, try it out, see if you like it. He'd never had it before, but he knew it was like, yeah, that's a bottom shelfer. Turned out that was an amazing bottle. Again, according to me, that was an amazing bottle. But I wanted to see what other people liked about it. And so they would go out and I would go and talk to people on the internet, go in these groups that people are, you know, sharing and trading and talking to each other about. And turned out at the same time that I was discovering this bottle, a bunch of other people were discovering it. And now that $30 bottle is very difficult to find and is one of those things that I got to see firsthand how
Wow.
much the market can shift in just a short period of time. Where this thing that I thought was really great turned out to be really great, and
Right.
turned out that everybody else thought so too. And then all of a sudden, it's gone. And so, very interesting. The I'm getting more and more into the older bottles too, which is really great. I got to there's a bar in Louisville called Neat, and their specialty is old dusties, meaning like none of their bottles for the most part are newer than like the year 2000. And so you have
Wow.
a lot of opportunities to taste history. And I was able to taste an old granddad from I think the 70s or 80s, and it was an incredible experience. And when they say old dusty, it is called that because they do have this sort of must to them.
Right.
I don't know if you've had the chance to taste anything. I'll have to send something for you, but it's an incredible experience. And it's just weird because I don't think you can't do this with most wine. I mean, you can obviously if you're storing it right and the conditions and all that. Whiskey is sort of just like it's whiskey. You can light it on fire and everything. And so when it comes to its longevity, you wouldn't think that it had that kind of stability. And it does change. Once it's bottled, it doesn't change much. It's not like when it's being distilled in the barrel, or sorry, being aged in the barrel. But when you have a bottle and you crack it open and it's from 40, 50, 60, whatever years ago, it's just a wild experience. It really is like tasting history. And you're like, if someone were to buy this new, the last time they drank that was 50 years ago. That's a
Right.
weird thing to sort of time travel to and taste that. And
Yeah.
it's different than the stuff that's coming out now. So very interesting.
That is amazing. Do you have a favorite time or place to drink?
Well, I was going to say all the time, but I don't want to sound like one of those guys. Um, yeah, one of my favorite things is when our organization is remote. We're fully remote, and when we get together, we have a home base in New York City, and we have a home base in Kentucky. And when we get together, actually doing that next week, we will end our nights by sitting on the porch, sharing a few cigars, and sharing a few whiskeys that we either collected that day or we have on our kind of reserve shelves. And we just chat, we just hang out, and it's one of the I never experienced that growing up because again, I didn't drink and I wasn't around any of that culture. I never went to any bars. And so being able to have that experience, that kind of brings it all back together. Like it's fun to trade. It's fun to use this as a commodity. It's fun to see the value of allowing, other people to trade. That is excellent. But at the end of the day, you really hope that people are cracking these bottles open and tasting it and sharing it. And they're sized. I'll grab this. They're sized in a way that you're obviously not drinking this alone in one sitting. Shouldn't be. And so it's a very shareable collectible, we'll say.
Yeah.
And that's what's interesting. You can collect sports cards, you can collect watches, you can collect clothing items, shoes. But the thing you're not really doing with that is sharing them.
Yeah.
And that's what's great about spirits and whiskey in general is you get something, you're excited by it, you are driven toward sharing that with other people and allowing them to have an experience they didn't otherwise have. And I think that is one of the most fantastic things about this industry is it is almost built on top of community and sharing.
There's no better way to end this episode than with that phrase. Scott, I hope that we can get to share some whiskey, bourbon, whatever, sometime. And thank you. Thank you for being here and for doing this episode with me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again for the opportunity. Appreciate it.